Captain, initiate a go-around. No, it's safe to land.
May 22nd, 2010. Just past 6 a.m., Air India Express Flight 812 was minutes from landing at Mangalore International Airport. The flight had been routine and uneventful, but as the aircraft approached the short tabletop runway, everything began to go wrong. The cockpit was calm, almost too calm, as critical warnings were ignored. The captain, confident and determined, continued the approach, but in less than 1 minute, what should have been a safe landing would turn into a catastrophe. The Boeing 737-800, carrying 166 people, would overshoot the runway and plunge into the valley below, making one of the deadliest aviation disasters in India's history. So, what caused this tragic crash? How did a seasoned crew and a modern aircraft fail on what seemed like an ordinary flight? This is the story of Air India Express Flight 812. Air India Express Flight 812 was a routine service connecting Dubai and Mangalore. On board that morning were 160 passengers and 6 crew members, including Captain Z. Glustica, a seasoned pilot with over 10,000 hours of flight experience, and First Officer H. Singh, who had logged nearly 4,000 hours himself. The Boeing 737-800 aircraft was equipped with a short-field performance package, making it well suited for operations at challenging airports like Mangalore. The Mangalore airport itself is classified as a critical airfield because of its location on a tabletop runway perched on a plateau, surrounded by steep drop-offs on both ends. It's a location that demands precision and focus, especially during landings. Runway 24, the designed landing strip, measures just over 8,000 feet, which is short by international standards. While manageable under normal circumstances, any deviation or delay in landing here can quickly turn dangerous. Despite these challenges, Flight 812's crew was experienced and familiar with the airport. Captain Glustica had landed in Mangalore 16 times before, and First Officer Singh had done so 66 times. By all accounts, this should have been another routine flight. The journey of Air India Express Flight 812 started on the evening of May 21, 2010, when it departed from Mangalore for Dubai. After a smooth outbound flight, the crew began preparing for the return leg back to Mangalore, scheduled to arrive early the next morning. The aircraft was refueled, the passengers boarded, and the flight crew settled back into their routine. The captain, a 55-year-old with extensive flying experience, had recently returned from a break in Serbia. His body clock was still adjusting, and it wasn't clear if he was fully rested. The first officer, a 40-year-old Indian national, was familiar with the route and the challenges it posed. Together, they prepared for what should have been a straightforward 4-hour flight. The return journey was uneventful at first. After taking off from Dubai, the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. As the hours ticked by, fatigue began to set in. At some point during the cruise, the captain fell asleep, leaving the first officer in charge of managing the flight and handling radio communications alone. While this might sound unusual, it's not uncommon on flights like this, where one pilot rests briefly while the other monitors the aircraft. However, this rest period exceeded the recommended limits, and the captain remained asleep as the flight neared Mangalore. At around 5:30 a.m., the aircraft made contact with Mangalore area control. The radar at the airport was down for maintenance, so air traffic controllers had to rely on procedural methods to guide aircraft. This meant relying on reports from pilots to determine their position and altitude, a slower process that can complicate operations. When the first officer requested descent clearance, air traffic control initially denied it, citing potential conflicts with other aircraft in the area. This delay meant the aircraft remained at a higher altitude for longer than usual, reducing the time and distance available to execute a smooth approach. The captain woke up as the aircraft began its descent, roughly 20 minutes before landing. Having just woken, he seemed groggy and disoriented, a state known as sleep inertia. Despite this, he resumed control of the aircraft, as company rules required the captain to handle landings at Mangalore because of the unusual and risky terrain of the airport's runway. Unfortunately, as they approached the airport, the crew failed to conduct an approach briefing. The approach briefing is basically a crucial step that outlines the descent plan, landing configuration, and potential go-around procedures. Without this briefing, the descent became rushed and uncoordinated. The aircraft was still much higher than it should have been when it reached the entry point for the DME arc, a curved approach path designed to help planes align with the runway. So, instead of following the proper descent path, the captain deployed the speed brakes and lowered the landing gear early in an attempt to lose altitude quickly. These actions increased the descent rate dramatically, making the approach unstable, and when the aircraft intercepted the localizer, it did so from above instead of below. This is dangerous because it could cause the plane to lock onto a phantom glide slope, leading it to descend at a steeper angle than intended. The aircraft was now descending too quickly, and the cockpit warnings and alarms went off. The first officer, seeing the danger, called for a go-around, a procedure where the landing is aborted and the plane circles back for another attempt. The captain, however, ignored the warnings and his co-pilot's suggestions. Instead, he pushed forward with the approach, believing he could still land the plane safely. At just 2.5 miles from the runway, the aircraft was still at 2,500 feet, double the altitude it should have been at this point. The first officer called for a go-round again, but the captain dismissed the idea, focusing solely on landing. As Air India Express Flight 812 approached runway 24, the situation in the cockpit was becoming increasingly dire. At just 200 feet above the runway threshold, the aircraft was still traveling at a dangerous speed of 160 knots, well above the recommended landing speed of 144 knots. The first officer, recognizing the danger, made one final plea. "Go around, Captain. We don't have runway left." But again, the suggestion was ignored. The Boeing 737-800 touched down far beyond the normal touchdown zone, with over half the runway already behind it. What followed was a desperate attempt to stop. The captain engaged reverse thrust and slammed on the brakes, but it was simply too late. The remaining 2,800 feet of the runway wasn't enough to slow the aircraft. As it sped toward the end of the tabletop runway, the captain made a last-ditch effort to go around, pushing the throttles forward in an attempt to take off again. But the plane couldn't achieve the speed needed to lift off. Instead, the engine surged, and the increased thrust cancelled out the little braking power remaining. The aircraft sped off the end of the runway, breaking through the boundary fence and the ILS antenna before plunging over the cliff at the runway's edge. The descent down the steep cliff was catastrophic. The aircraft hit the rocky terrain below, breaking apart on impact. A fire erupted, consuming much of the wreckage. Of the 166 people on board, only 8 survived, pulled from the wreckage by local villagers who were the first to arrive at the crash site. The crash of Air India Express Flight 812 left an indelible mark on the people of Mangalore and the broader aviation community. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, but the location of the wreckage made the response incredibly challenging. Many of the only 8 people who survived had been seated near the back of the aircraft, where the impact was slightly less severe. In the wake of the tragedy, investigators from India's Directorate General of Civil Aviation and the Boeing company began piecing together the events that led to the crash. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder revealed a troubling series of missteps and systematic issues. One of the key findings was the captain's state of fatigue. Despite regulations allowing brief rest during flights, the captain had slept for over an hour during the cruise, likely entering a deep sleep. When he woke up just 20 minutes before landing, he exhibited signs of sleep inertia that most likely impaired his decision-making during the critical descent phase. The investigation also revealed the crew's failure to conduct an approach briefing, a basic procedure that would have allowed them to plan their descent and align their approach much better than they eventually did. This oversight left the aircraft too high and too fast to execute a safe landing. Another contributing factor was the procedural air traffic control in place that morning due to a radar outage. The delayed descent clearance forced the aircraft to descend quickly over a short distance, making it difficult to stabilize the approach. Lastly, the crash also exposed deeper issues in cockpit dynamics. Despite repeated warnings and calls to go around, The first officer deferred to the captain, following standard operating procedures that placed final authority in the captain's hands. This power dynamic prevented timely intervention, a failure that proved fatal. In response to the disaster, Air India Express and regulatory authorities implemented sweeping changes. Training programs were updated to emphasize cockpit resource management, ensuring that first officers could challenge captains in critical situations. The importance of approach briefings and adherence to stabilized approach criteria was also reinforced across the aviation industry. The crash also sparked important discussions about pilot fatigue. In aviation, where even a momentary lapse in judgment can be fatal, ensuring that flight crews are well rested isn't just a regulation, it's a necessity. Many airlines have since revisited their policies on rest periods, scheduling practices, and fatigue management. In the memory of the 158 people who lost their lives in the crash, a memorial service is held at the crash site every year. The site is also now marked by a park and a monument to honor the victims. What do you think about the changes made in the aftermath of this tragedy? Have they been enough to address the systematic issues that contributed to this crash? What are your thoughts about runways like the one in Mangalore? Don't hesitate to let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more content like this, and ring the notification bell so you'll be among the first to know when we publish next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.